Before we begin, if you enjoy tales woven from history's oddest threads, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions for more delightfully dull bedtime stories. Now settle in as we drift back to a time when punctuality was a myth, silence was a luxury, and one very tired monk was about to make a terrible mistake. Chapter 1. The Restless Monastery. The monastery of St. Drogo the Unblinking was, by all accounts, a disaster. Nestled in a valley that seemed designed to amplify every cough, sneeze, and belch for miles, the stone walls did little to muffle the cacophony of monastic life. Brothers snored like war horses, novices dropped prayer books with the grace of fainting goats, and the abbot's lectures on piety could, and did, last longer than some minor sieges. Into this symphony of chaos stumbled Brother Emmerich, a man so perpetually sleep-deprived he once mistook his own sandal for a piece of toast. Emmerich's problem was simple. He was terrible at waking up. While the other monks rose at the unholy hour of matins, he remained blissfully unconscious, often until the sun was high enough to mock him through the stained glass windows. His excuses were creative. Demonic possession, a sudden allergy to dawn, a rogue badger blocking the door. But the abbot's patience was wearing thinner than the monastery's porridge. One particularly grim morning, after Emmerich overslept through lauds, prime, and most of terce, the abbot cornered him in the cloister. "Brother," he said, with the calm of a man who had already imagined throwing Emmerich down a well, "if you cannot rise with the others, perhaps you should sleep in the latrine. At least there your snoring will be drowned out by more natural sounds." Emmerich, who had once tried to fashion a pillow out of a loaf of bread, knew he needed a solution. The monastery's existing methods of waking the brethren were unreliable. There was Brother Thaddeus, whose job it was to shake everyone awake, but he often got distracted mid-task and wandered off to count cobwebs. Then there was the bell-ringer, Brother Clement, who had the timing of a drunkard and the subtlety of a landslide. Driven by desperation and a faint hope of redemption, Emmerich began experimenting. His first attempt involved tying a rope to his toe and the other end to a passing goat. The goat, unimpressed by theology, simply ate the rope and wandered away. Next, he tried balancing a bucket of water above his bed, rigged to tip at dawn. This worked exactly once, and only because the bucket leaked all night, leaving him damp, furious, and still asleep. The breakthrough came, as many terrible ideas do, in the dead of night. Emmerich had been staring at the monastery's sole clock, a massive, temperamental thing that told the hours with the enthusiasm of a dying walrus. It was powered by weights, creaked like a ship in a storm, and was wrong more often than it was right. But as Emmerich watched the gears grind, a thought struck him. What if the clock could be smaller? What if it could be personal? What if it could be his? And so, with the grim determination of a man who had nothing left to lose, Emmerich began stealing. A gear here, a weight there, a handful of nails from the carpenter's shed. He worked in secret, hunched over his cot like a conspirator, crafting a device that would, in theory, jolt him awake at the desired hour. It was a mess of wood, metal, and blind optimism, held together by prayer and sheer spite. The night before its first test, Emmerich whispered to his creation, "You will save me." The device, being an inanimate object, did not reply. It did, however, look vaguely sinister in the candlelight. When dawn came, so did the sound, a clattering, shrieking, unholy noise that tore through the dormitory like a demon escaping a teapot. Monks bolted upright, screaming about divine wrath and possible plagues. Brother Thaddeus, convinced it was the last trump, began hastily confessing to sins he hadn't even committed. And Emmerich was awake, triumphant, and as the abbot's shadow fell over him, deeply, deeply regretful. For you see, in his quest to never oversleep again, Brother Emmerich had invented the first alarm clock. And as the abbot's voice boomed over the chaos, one thing became clear. No one was thanking him for it. The monastery would never be the same. Neither would. And somewhere, in the darkness of his workshop, the little wooden terror waited for its next victim. Chapter 2. Divine Inspiration or Desperation. Brother Emmerich sat on the cold stone floor of his cell, rubbing his temples as the last echoes of the morning's chaos faded. The abbot's lecture had been thorough, blistering, and, most distressingly, punctuated by several long pauses where he simply stared at Emmerich, as if trying to decide whether to excommunicate him or sell him to traveling merchants. The other monks had taken to calling his invention the Devil's Doorbell, and even Brother Clement, who had once tried to baptize a rooster, looked at him with something akin to fear. Yet, despite the backlash, Emmerich couldn't shake the thrill of success. For the first time in his monastic career, he had not overslept. True, his awakening had caused a minor existential crisis among the brethren, but was that not a small price to pay for punctuality? The abbot, of course, had disagreed. Loudly. Determined to refine his creation and avoid further disciplinary action, Emmerich slunk to the monastery's library, a damp, mold-scented room where books were chained to the shelves, not out of reverence, but because they might otherwise flee the miserable condition. He pored over manuscripts on mechanics, astrology, and even a suspiciously stained treatise on the art of timekeeping, which mostly consisted of vague warnings about angry celestial influences. It was there, between a sneezing fit and an unfortunate encounter with a spider the size of a small apple, that Emmerich had his second revelation. The monastery's great clock was a monstrosity, yes, but it was also predictable, if one ignored the fact that it occasionally ran backward during thunderstorms. If he could build something smaller, something portable, something that didn't sound like a damned soul escaping a wine barrel, perhaps he could salvage both his reputation and his sleep schedule. His first challenge was materials. The monastery was not, as a rule, overflowing with spare parts. The blacksmith, Brother Hengist, guarded his scrap metal like a dragon hoarding gold, and the carpenter, Brother Oswin, had once threatened to exorcise Emerich's sandals for squeaking too loudly. Undeterred, Emmerich resorted to what he did best, creative borrowing. A spoon from the refectory, a hinge from a rotting chest, a length of twine that may or may not have been holding up someone's undergarments. His pockets jingled with ill-gotten gears, and his conscience, already strained from years of oversleeping, barely twitched. His second challenge was secrecy. The abbot had forbidden further nocturnal engineering, which Emmerich felt was an unfair term for what he considered holy problem-solving. So, he worked by candlelight, muffling his hammering with a stolen pillow, jumping at every creak of the dormitory floorboards. Once, when Brother Thaddeus shuffled past his cell muttering about the end times, Emmerich hid his half-assembled device under his habit and pretended to be deeply engrossed in prayer. The ruse worked, though he later had to spend an hour untangling a gear from his beard. Days blurred into nights, as Emmerich tinkered, cursed, and tinkered some more. His new design was less of a thing and more of a e-concept. A small, enclosed mechanism with a weighted trigger that would, in theory, swing a tiny hammer against a tiny bell at a predetermined hour. Simple. Elegant. Foolproof. The night of the final test arrived. Emmerich wound the mechanism with trembling fingers, set the weight, and placed the contraption gingerly on his bedside stool. Oh! Then he lay down, staring at the ceiling, waiting. Was this divine inspiration? Or just the fevered desperation of a man who had once tried to convince the abbot that hibernation was a valid monastic practice? Dawn came. The device twitched. A faint EG ping echoed through the cell. Emmerich bolted upright, heart pounding. It had worked. Not the earth-shattering cacophony of before, but a soft, almost polite chime. He had done it. He had tamed time itself. Then the bell fell off. The tiny hammer, over-enthusiastic in its duties, had struck with such force that the entire mechanism shuddered, groaned, and launched the bell directly at Emeric's forehead. He yelped, clapping a hand over the new bruise blooming on his brow, and stared at the now mutilated device. It lay in pieces, gears rolling lazily across the floor as if amused by their own rebellion. Outside, the monastery's great clock wheezed out the hour, its usual cacophony a mocking counterpoint to Emeric's failure. Somewhere, he was sure, the abbot was waking up with a sense of dread he couldn't explain. Emeric sighed, gathered the scattered parts, and reached for his stolen spoon. This was not over. Not by a long shot. Chapter 3. The first prototype, a disaster. Brother Emeric sat cross-legged on the floor of his cell, staring at the scattered remains of his failed alarm device with the kind of resignation usually reserved for men who had just realized they'd accidentally excommunicated themselves. The tiny bell had rolled under his cot, the spoon was bent beyond recognition, and the stolen hinge now seemed to be judging him from its place atop a prayer book. It was time to admit defeat, at least on the mechanical front. But Emeric was nothing if not adaptable. If gears and weights refused to cooperate, perhaps nature itself could be persuaded to do the job. After all, the monastery's rooster, a particularly spiteful bird named Lucifer, for reasons that became obvious within moments of meeting him, woke the entire cloister every dawn without fail. The creature's crowing could peel paint from walls, and had once startled a visiting bishop into dropping his ceremonial crozier down a well. If Emeric could harness that kind of power, he would never oversleep again. The plan was simple. He would tie a rope around Lucifer's leg, run the other end through his cell window, and attach it to a bucket of water suspended directly above his bed. When the rooster crowed at dawn, the movement would yank the rope, tipping the bucket and dousing him awake. It was elegant. It was foolproof. It was, in hindsight, a catastrophe waiting to happen. Stealing the bucket was easy. Brother Oswin had a whole stack of them, and counting had never been his strong suit. The rope proved more challenging. The monastery's supply was carefully monitored after an incident involving a novice, 3 goats, and an ill-advised attempt at constructing a catapult. Emeric eventually settled on repurposing the cord from his own habit's belt, reasoning that modesty was a small price to pay for punctuality. The real test came at midnight, when the cloister was silent, save for the occasional snore or the distant sound of Brother Thaddeus, whispering to a broomhead convinced himself was Saint Drogo in disguise. Emeric crept into the chicken coop, barefoot and squinting in the moonlight, his stolen supplies clutched to his chest. Lucifer, sensing impending nonsense, stirred in his roost and fixed Emeric with a beady glare. "This will only take a moment," Emeric whispered, reaching for the rooster's leg. Lucifer disagreed. What followed was less an act of animal husbandry, and more a frenzied skirmish that would later be described by witnesses as a fight with a very small, very angry demon. Lucifer pecked, flapped, and screeched like a creature personally offended by the concept of human dignity. Emeric, in turn, yelped, tripped over a feed bucket, and accidentally pulled the coop's door shut behind him, trapping himself inside with an increasingly enraged bird. By the time he managed to loop the rope around Lucifer's leg, a feat accomplished mostly by blind luck, and the rooster pausing to gloat, Emeric was bleeding from 3 separate peck wounds. His habit was missing a sleeve, and his sandal had mysteriously vanished. He limped back to his cell, tied the other end of the rope to the precariously balanced bucket, and collapsed onto his cot, too exhausted to care that his blanket was now damp from an earlier unrelated water spill. Dawn came. Lucifer crowed. The rope jerked. The bucket tipped. And then, nothing. Emeric blinked awake to find the bucket still swinging gently above him, the water inside sloshing but not spilling. The rope had stretched just enough to prevent a full tip. He frowned. Had he miscalculated? Then Lucifer crowed again. "I know," Within, see, feeding combat. This time, the rope snapped taut with such force that the bucket didn't just tip, it launched. A torrent of water arced through the air, drenching Emmerich, his cot, and the half-finished manuscript of his penitent psalms, now reduced to a sodden lump. The bucket itself, freed from its constraints, spun wildly before crashing into the opposite wall and ricocheting directly into Brother Thaddeus' open cell door. A moment of stunned silence followed. Then from down the hall, "Praise be, the Lord hath sent me a sign." Emmerich groaned and peeled a damp page of psalms off his forehead. Outside, Lucifer, now thoroughly tangled in rope, enraged, and dragging a length of Emmerich's former belt, charged into the cloister garden, where he proceeded to terrorize the herb beds, upend a bench, and terrify a group of novices into believing the apocalypse had arrived in feathery form. By the time the abbot arrived, drawn by the noise, the scene was one of pure chaos. A sopping wet monk, a rampaging rooster, and a bucket that had somehow ended up on the chapel roof. The abbot closed his eyes, inhaled deeply, and said the only thing that could sum up the situation. Emmerich, dripping and bruised, gave a weak smile. "I may need to rethink the design." Somewhere in the distance, Lucifer crowed again, this time in what sounded distinctly like triumph. Chapter 4. Brotherhood of the Annoyed. The morning after the great rooster incident, Brother Emmerich found himself standing before the entire monastic community. His habit still slightly damp in unflattering places, his forehead adorned with a fresh bruise from the runaway bucket, and his dignity nowhere to be found. The abbot had called an emergency chapter meeting, a rare event usually reserved for outbreaks of plague or particularly heretical cheese-making. Today, however, the sole topic of discussion was Emmerich and his infernal contraptions. The refectory buzzed with murmured debate. Some monks clutched their rosaries as though Emmerich's inventions were cursed artifacts. Others, the more pragmatically sleep-deprived among them, eyed him with cautious interest. Brother Hengist, the blacksmith, had even brought a small notebook, which he scribbled in periodically, though whether he was taking notes or drafting Emmerich's excommunication papers remained unclear. The abbot cleared his throat with the gravitas of a man who had already mentally composed 6 different punishments. "Brother Emmerich," he began, "your devices have disturbed the peace of this holy house. First, the unholy clanging, then the rooster debacle, and now," he gestured helplessly at the bucket-shaped dent in the refectory wall. Emmerich opened his mouth to defend himself, but Brother Thaddeus cut in, his voice trembling with either divine inspiration or indigestion. "I saw it with mine own eyes. The bucket flew like a discus of the ancients. Surely this is a sign." "A sign of what, exactly?" asked Brother Oswin, who had spent the better part of the morning untangling Lucifer from the remains of Emmerich's rope belt. "A sign that Brother Emmerich should perhaps stick to copying manuscripts," muttered Brother Clement, the bell-ringer, who had been enjoying a peaceful career of inconsistent timekeeping until Emmerich's experiments cast his own shortcomings into sharp relief. But not all were opposed. Brother Alcuin, the monastery scribe, and a man who had once tried to alphabetize the chapel candles, leaned forward with unexpected enthusiasm. "Consider the possibilities," he said. "A device that ensures we rise at the same hour each day, no more relying on Brother Clement's interpretive tolling of the bells." This earned a scandalized gasp from Clement, who immediately began justifying his methods. "The bells ring when the Lord moves me to ring them. Sometimes he moves me after breakfast. Who are we to question divine timing?" The debate raged. Some argued Emmerich's inventions were a blasphemous meddling with God's natural order. Others countered that if God had not wanted monks to tinker, he would not have made Brother Hengist so adept at forging nails. A few, like Brother Alcuin, saw practical potential, though even they admitted that any further experiments should ideally not involve projectiles. Through it all, Emeric stood silently, absorbing the criticism like a particularly pious sponge. Then, just as the abbot opened his mouth to deliver what promised to be a crushing verdict, a miracle occurred. Lucifer, still bristling from the previous night's indignities, strutted into the refectory, flapped onto the high table, and deposited a single defiant clump of feathers directly onto the abbot's psalter. A stunned silence fell. Then, from the back of the room, a single voice spoke. "Perhaps," said Brother Hengist slowly, "we could discuss the unmetal version." The abbot closed his eyes. Emeric bit back a grin, and somewhere, in the shadowy recesses of the monastery's workshop, the future of alarm clocks and monastic sanity hung in the balance. Chapter 5. The Abbot's Verdict. The abbot's private chamber smelled of beeswax, old parchment, and the faintest hint of desperation. It was a place where weighty decisions were made, where disputes over lentil distributions were settled, and where, on one memorable occasion, Brother Thaddeus had been gently informed that no, the vegetable garden was not I speaking to him in tongue. Now, as the abbot sat behind his worn oak desk, fingers steepled under his chin, he found himself facing what might be the most perplexing quandary of his ecclesiastical career. What to do about Brother Emeric and his wretched clock? Emeric stood before him, shifting from foot to foot like a man who suspected the floor might open beneath him at any moment. His habit was rumpled, his eyes still red-rimmed from lack of sleep, and there was a fresh stain on his sleeve that smelled suspiciously of rooster. The abbot sighed. "Brother Emeric," he began, his voice carefully neutral, "you have caused quite the stir." Emeric opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had prepared several defenses, arguments about the sanctity of punctuality, the virtues of invention, even a half-formed theological justification involving the parable of the 10 virgins. But now, faced with the abbot's weary gaze, they all seemed woefully inadequate. The abbot continued. "Your intentions, I believe, were not without merit. Punctuality is, as you have so enthusiastically demonstrated, a virtue our humble monastery could stand to cultivate." He paused, glancing at the small pile of broken clock parts that had been deposited on his desk earlier that morning. "Your methods, however, leave something to be desired." Emeric swallowed. "I understand, Father Abbot, but if I might—" "No buckets," the abbot interrupted. Emeric blinked. "No buckets? No buckets, no roosters, no devices that cause Brother Thaddeus to proclaim the end times before breakfast." The abbot leaned forward slightly. "If you are to continue this project of yours, it will be under strict supervision. Brother Hengist will assist you in crafting something that does not resemble a siege weapon. Brother Alcuin will document the process, lest future generations accuse us of encouraging madness. And you will not attest it during holy offices? Am I understood?" Emeric's shoulders sagged with relief. "Yes, Father Abbot. Thank you." The abbot waved a hand dismissively. "Do not thank me yet. If this contraption of yours so much as whispers during vespers, I will reassign you to latrine duty until the second coming." He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "And for the love of all that is holy, stop stealing spoons." Outside, the monastery buzzed with speculation. Some monks had already begun placing bets on how long it would take for Emeric's next invention to malfunction spectacularly. Brother Clement had taken to ringing the bells with extra vigor, as if to remind everyone that traditional timekeeping required no gears, no weights, and certainly no poultry. But in the workshop, as Brother Hengist handed Emeric a properly forged gear and Brother Alcuin sharpened his quill with scholarly anticipation, something remarkable happened. Progress. The first prototype had been a disaster. The second had been a catastrophe. But this time, with grudging support and a complete lack of livestock involvement. Brother Emeric allowed himself to hope. Of course, hope was a dangerous thing in a place where the only constant was chaos. And as the shadows lengthened across the cloister, the abbot couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a terrible mistake. Somewhere in the distance, Lucifer crowed. It did not sound encouraging. Chapter 6. Refinements and Regrets. The workshop had become Brother Emmerich's sanctuary, a dimly lit corner of the monastery, where the scent of oiled metal and sawdust almost overpowered the ever-present aroma of damp stone and overcooked pork. Under Brother Hengist's grudging supervision, the third iteration of the alarm clock was taking shape. A compact wooden box housing carefully fitted gears, a weighted trigger, and a small bronze bell that promised to be loud enough to rouse even the heaviest sleeper without summoning the entire cloister to witness the apocalypse. Progress was slow but steady. Hengist, despite his initial skepticism, had warmed to the challenge, his thick fingers surprisingly deft as he filed rough edges from the clock's inner workings. Brother Alkian, meanwhile, hovered nearby, scribbling notes with the fervor of a man documenting a miracle. "Remarkable," he muttered, squinting at the mechanism. "If this works, we might finally discover whether Brother Thaddeus' snoring is, in fact, a form of plainsong." Emmerich, hunched over the workbench, adjusted a gear with the tip of his knife. His hands were nicked and stained, his back ached from hours of bending, and his eyes burned from lack of sleep. But for the first time since this madness began, he felt a flicker of pride. This version was elegant. Precede, kind, a far cry from the cobbled-together disasters that had preceded it. Then Hengist ruined the moment by asking the question Emmerich had been avoiding. "Why?" Emmerich blinked. "Why what?" The blacksmith wiped his hands on his apron, leaving smears of grease across the rough fabric. "Why go through all this trouble? Most brothers just accept that matins is an unholy hour and learn to live with the misery." Emmerich opened his mouth to reply, then hesitated. The truth was embarrassingly simple. He had never considered whether he wanted to wake up on time. The challenge had consumed him. The thrill of solving an unsolvable problem, the stubborn refusal to admit defeat. But now, faced with the imminent success of his invention, a new and troubling thought occurred to him. Waking up on time meant being on time. It meant facing the full, unrelenting drudgery of monastic life, without the buffer of tardiness to soften the blow. Alcuin, sensing his hesitation, chuckled dryly. "Ah, you've realized the flaw in your own design." Emmerich frowned. "What flaw?" "The flaw inherent in all great inventions," Alcuin said, tapping his quill against the parchment. "They work." The clock's first successful test came 3 days later. At precisely the appointed hour, the mechanism whirred to life. The hammer struck the bell with a crisp ping, and Emmerich, who had been pretending to sleep for the sake of the experiment, jerked upright, heart pounding. It was perfect. It was horrible. Because now, for the first time in his monastic career, he was awake for the full, ungodly length of matins. The service stretched before him like a desert of psalms, each verse drier than the last. Brother Clement's chanting took on a new sadistic quality when experienced without the usual fog of half-sleep. The stone floor, which had never felt particularly forgiving, now seemed designed to punish the soles of his feet with medieval precision. And Brother Thaddeus, who had taken to whispering commentary on the scripture under his breath, was revealed to be even more unhinged than Emmerich had previously suspected. By the time the service ended, Emmerich's knees ached, his throat was raw from attempted responses, and he had developed a newfound sympathy for Brother Hengist's habit of accidentally setting things on fire during particularly tedious sermons. Back in the workshop, as he stared at the innocuous little box that had betrayed him so thoroughly, Emmerich felt a wave of despair. He had done it. He had conquered time. And in doing so, he had made his life infinitely worse. Hengist, sharpening a chisel nearby, took one look at Emmerich's face and burst into laughter. "Welcome to punctuality," he said, wiping his eyes. "It's terrible. Emmerich groaned and dropped his forehead onto the workbench with a thud. The bell, as if sensing his distress, gave one last, mocking G-ping. Somewhere outside, Lucifer crowed in agreement. Chapter 7. A noisy miracle spreads. The first visitor arrived just after Lauds, his horse kicking up mud from the previous night's rain as he dismounted in the monastery courtyard. He was a merchant, his tunic embroidered with thread that cost more than the monastery's annual wine budget, and he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never once overslept a profitable opportunity. Brother Oswin, who had been mending a fence nearby, squinted at him with suspicion. "You're here for the clock?" the merchant said, not bothering with pleasantries. Oswin blinked. "The what?" "The clocking," the merchant repeated, as though speaking to a particularly dim child. "The little device that rings at a set hour. I've heard it's a marvel." Oswin's expression darkened. "Who told you about that?" The merchant waved a dismissive hand. "Brother Thaddeus. Met him at the market yesterday. He was selling indulgences and talking about the noisy miracle your monastery had invented." Oswin groaned. Thaddeus had been banned from the market after the leak incident, but somehow he always found a way back. And now, thanks to his loose tongue, the monastery's greatest embarrassment, and admittedly its only innovation, was about to become public knowledge. By noon, 3 more merchants had arrived, all clamoring to see the clock. By vespers, a minor nobleman steward had joined the crowd, clutching a purse that jingled temptingly. And by the time the abbot finally emerged from his chambers to assess the commotion, a small crowd had gathered in the courtyard, buzzing with excitement. The abbot turned to Emmerich, who had been attempting to hide behind Brother Hengist's considerable bulk. "Explain." Emmerich swallowed. "It appears Brother Thaddeus may have shared news of the invention." "Shared?" The abbot's voice was dangerously calm. "He's sharing it with half the damned county." Hengist cleared his throat. "To be fair, Father Abbot, it was impressive." "It's a box that makes noise at dawn," the abbot snapped. "That's not a miracle. That's a rooster with delusions of grandeur." But the crowd disagreed. To them, the clock was more than a contraption. It was a promise. Merchants saw guaranteed punctuality for caravans. Nobles saw an end to tardy servants. One particularly enthusiastic baker had already begun drafting plans for a clock that could wake him in time to knead dough before sunrise. Even the monastery's own brothers, who had spent weeks complaining about Emmerich's experiments, now stood a little straighter, basking in the unexpected prestige. Then the letter arrived. It was sealed with wax, the color of old blood, stamped with the unmistakable insignia of the papal court. The abbot read it in silence, his face unreadable. When he finally looked up, the entire monastery held its breath. "His Holiness," the abbot said slowly, "has heard of our mechanical marvel. He wishes to examine it." A stunned silence followed. Then chaos. Monks burst into excited chatter. Brother Thaddeus fell to his knees, proclaiming divine intervention. Brother Clement immediately began ringing the bells in what he presumably believed was a celebratory fashion, but sounded more like a fire alarm. Emmerich, meanwhile, felt the blood drain from his face. The Pope. The Abbe Pope wanted to see his clock. The same clock that had, not 3 days prior, malfunctioned and dumped an entire vial of ink onto Brother Alcuin's best parchment. The same clock that still occasionally spat gears like a petulant child. The same clock that was, at this very moment, held together in one corner by a strip of leather and what might have been a dried noodle. Hengist clapped a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Cheer up," he said, grinning. "If it breaks in front of the Pope, at least you'll go down in history." Emmerich groaned. Somewhere in the distance, as if sensing his despair, Lucifer crowed. The clock's days of quiet obscurity were over, and Emmerich's nightmares, it seemed, were just beginning. Chapter 8. The Unholy Patent Dispute. The delegation from the monastery of St. Mortimer the Early Riser arrived on a Tuesday, though by the time they finished arguing over whether it was still Tuesday or technically Wednesday by their own reckoning, Brother Emeric had developed a throbbing headache that no amount of prayer would cure. They were an austere group, clad in robes so starched they could have stood upright without occupants, led by a Prior Anselm, whose eyebrows looked permanently frozen in an expression of pious disapproval. They brought with them a wooden chest, ominously large, and a claim that sent the entire cloister into uproar. The alarm clock, they insisted, was gay theory invention. Prior Anselm unfolded a meticulously copied manuscript with the gravitas of a man presenting sacred scripture. "Behold," he intoned, "the writings of our own brother Silas, who devised a mechanical bell-ringing device no less than 15 years ago." Brother Alcuin, who had spent the last month documenting Emeric's trials and errors, squinted at the text. This says he tied a bell to a dog's tail and relied on the animal's predictable morning flatulences to create noise. That's not an alarm clock. That's animal cruelty with poor timekeeping. The visiting monks gasped in unison. Prior Anselm's face darkened. The principle remains sound. A beast of God's creation rousing the faithful at dawn. "A dog farting is not a mechanical innovation," Hengist muttered, loud enough for the entire chapter house to hear. What followed was less a theological debate and more a brawl with Latin quotations. The St. Mortimer monks produced increasingly dubious evidence: a sundial that only worked if you held it upside down, a water clock that had apparently drowned 3 separate attendants, and a claim that their patron saint had invented the concept of punctuality after being struck by lightning while late for vespers. Emeric, caught between defending his invention and wondering if he could fake his own death, watched as the abbot massaged his temples with increasing vigor. The papal envoy, who had arrived just that morning to finalize arrangements for displaying the clock in Rome, observed the chaos with the detached amusement of a man who would be leaving soon. Then Prior Anselm played his final card. With a dramatic flourish he produced a small tarnished bell from the depths of his robe. "This," he declared, "is the very bell used in Brother Silas's original design. Sacred relic of our order." Brother Clement, who had been unusually quiet until now, leaned forward. "That's the bell from our old goat harness." Silence fell. Prior Anselm blinked. "What?" "The bell," Clement repeated. "From the goat harness. We lost it during that ill-advised attempt to train them to pull a cart. You stole our goat bell." The St. Mortimer monks exchanged glances. Prior Anselm's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "That is a baseless accusation." Hengist, who had been examining the bell, snorted. "It's got Brother Oswin's initials scratched into it, and what appears to be goat spit." The ensuing uproar lasted until sunset, at which point the abbot declared the matter settled in favor of St. Drogos by divine providence, and also the fact that no one wanted to listen to Prior Anselm's increasingly unhinged theories about canine horology anymore. The defeated monks retreated, taking their disputed relics and at least 2 of St. Drogos' spoons with them. As peace returned to the cloister, Emeric stared at his battered clock, now officially recognized as both an invention and a headache. "Next time," he told Hengist wearily, "I'm inventing something quiet, like pillows." Somewhere in the distance Lucifer crowed. Whether in celebration or warning, it was impossible to say. Chapter 9. The Monk's Existential Crisis. Brother Emeric stood in the monastery's herb garden, clutching a bundle of wilted lavender like a drowning man grasping at straws, and listened to the sounds of his own damnation echoing across the valley. Dawn had broken, not gently as dawns ought to, but with the violent precision of his infernal devices. From the village below, at least a dozen alarm clocks rang out in jagged unison, followed by the predictable chorus of curses, shouted at windows, slammed shutters, and one particularly creative peasant who was apparently throwing shoes at his neighbor's rooster. in protest. It had been 6 months since the papal endorsement. 6 months since his humble noisy box had become the must-have accessory for every punctuality-obsessed nobleman, merchant, and, God help them all, even some enthusiastic peasants. The workshop at St. Drogo's now produced 3 clocks a week, each one sold before the varnish dried. Brother Hengist had developed a permanent squint from squinting at tiny gears. Brother Alcuin's documentation had swelled to 3 volumes, ominously titled Ron, the Mechanical Torment of Mankind. And Emmerich had become famous. The realization hit him like a poorly balanced bucket of water. Somewhere between the first prototype and the papal bull, he had become I Brother Emmerich, Inventor Horology, a title that sounded impressive right up until you realized it mostly meant people blamed you for their lack of sleep. The baker who had once praised him for fresh dawn bread now muttered about that demon-summoning monk when Emmerich passed. The village children had invented a skipping rhyme about the clock fiend. Even Lucifer, the rooster, seemed to regard him with newfound resentment, as though offended by the competition. Worse still were the letters. Dozens of them piled on his cot each morning, demanding louder alarms, gentler alarms, alarms that could distinguish between weekdays and Sundays. A particularly unhinged missive from a Venetian merchant suggested adding a small flail to really get the blood moving. Emmerich sank onto a weathered bench, the lavender crumbling in his grip. What had he done? He'd set out to solve a simple problem, his own chronic lateness, and somehow ended up ushering in an age of sleep-deprived tyranny. The world had traded the gentle unreliability of roosters and church bells for the iron fist of mechanical precision, and everyone, it seemed, hated him for it. "You look," observed Brother Hengist, appearing suddenly beside him with 2 mugs of suspiciously strong cider, "like a man who's just realized he's invented the shovel everyone will use to dig his own grave." Emmerich accepted the mug without comment. Hengist sat heavily, the bench groaning in protest. "It's not all bad. The abbot's pleased with the monastery's new roof, and the stained glass window of St. Drogo punching a heretic was a nice touch." "That's not—" Emmerich rubbed his face. "I didn't mean for it to be like this. It was supposed to help." "And it does," Hengist said cheerfully. "It helps people wake up miserable and exhausted. A valuable service." Emmerich groaned. Hengist took a long swig of cider. "Look, you've got 2 choices. Either you vanish into the wilderness and become a hermit, which, between us, you'd be terrible at, or you accept that you've changed the world in a small, annoying way, like fleas or taxation." Somewhere, in the village below, a particularly persistent alarm clock continued ringing, its tinny jangle bouncing off the valley walls, like the world's least pleasant echo. Emmerich stared into his cider. He had, he realized, invented the future, and the future was loud. Lucifer chose that moment to stride into the garden, fix Emmerich with a beady glare, and crow directly into his face. It was, all things considered, a fair critique. Chapter 10. The King's Commission. The royal messenger arrived on horseback, his cloak embroidered with enough gold thread to feed the monastery for a year, and an expression that suggested he found the entire enterprise beneath him. He dismounted with the careful grace of a man who expected the ground itself to be unworthy of his boots, and handed Brother Emmerich a scroll sealed with enough wax to drown a small animal. Emmerich broke the seal with trembling fingers. The parchment unfurled, revealing an ornate script that began with "Vi-A-B, the grace of God," and also "because we said so," and ended with a demand that made his stomach drop. "Our most royal self requires a clock unlike any other, one fit to rouse a king from slumber with suitable grandeur. Let it sound not with common bells, but with trumpets. Let it herald not merely the hour, but our divine majesty's awakening, and let it be ready within the fortnight, lest we reconsider our generous decision not to have you hanged for the crime of existing within our realm." The messenger cleared his throat. His Majesty expects your immediate compliance." Emeric opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. Behind him, Brother Hengist let out a low whistle. "Trumpets," he muttered, "because nothing says holy devotion like startling yourself awake with a fanfare." The abbot, who had been watching the exchange with the resigned air of a man who had long since given up on divine intervention, sighed. "We shall begin at once," he said, shooting Emeric a look that very clearly added, "And this is entirely your fault." The next 2 weeks were a blur of sawdust, solder, and existential dread. Emeric and Hengist labored from dawn until the stars mocked them through the workshop's single grimy window. The king's specifications were as excessive as they were impractical. A miniature brass trumpet that required a system of bellows, a mechanical herald, no taller than a loaf of bread that would bow upon activation. Most baffling of all, a compartment for incense, because His Majesty wished to wake not only alert, but fragrant. Brother Alkeen, documenting the process with increasing alarm, paused mid-scribble. "This is no longer an alarm clock. This is a theatrical production." Hengist wiped sweat from his brow. "A theatrical production that will end with all of us in the stocks if it doesn't work." The final product was, by any measure, ridiculous. The trumpets gleamed, the herald's jointed arms moved with eerie precision, and the incense burner, after 3 failed attempts, actually produced smoke instead of sparks. It was also, Emeric realized with dawning horror, the single most ostentatious way to wake up ever devised by man or beast. On the morning of delivery, as the royal guards loaded the contraption onto a padded wagon, because God forbid a king's alarm clock experienced discomfort on the road, the abbot placed a heavy hand on Emeric's shoulder. "Pray," he said quietly, "that His Majesty enjoys being startled awake by a miniature brass fanfare." Emeric did pray. He prayed fervently. But as the wagon disappeared down the road, kicking up dust in its wake, he couldn't shake the image of a furious monarch, a malfunctioning herald, and a very short path to the gallows. Somewhere in the distance, Lucifer crowed, a sound that, for the first time, struck Emeric as refreshingly simple. Chapter 11. The Industrialization of Annoyance. The first alarm clock workshop outside the monastery walls appeared in the village before the last autumn leaves had fallen. By winter solstice, there were 3. By spring, the rhythmic clang of hammers, shaping clock castings, had become the unofficial soundtrack of the valley, drowning out bird song, church bells, and what little peace remained in the world. Emeric saw the consequences firsthand when he ventured down to the market for the first time in months. The stalls were full of clocks, clocks with brass bells, clocks with tin whistles, clocks adorned with grotesque carvings of startled-looking saints. A merchant waved one under his nose, its painted face leering. "Guaranteed to wake the dead, brother, or your money back." Behind him, 2 apprentices from the blacksmith shop were demonstrating their latest model to a crowd of reluctant onlookers. "Watch this," one crowed, winding the mechanism with a flourish. The resulting clang was so violent it startled a nearby donkey into kicking over a barrel of apples. The crowd, rather than applauding, groaned in unison. "Another one," muttered a weaver, rubbing her temples. "Haven't we suffered enough?" The blacksmith's apprentice, either oblivious or actively malicious, beamed. "This one's special. It rings 8 Weichen if you hit the snooze function." Emeric edged away before anyone could recognize him as the architect of this waking nightmare. But escape proved impossible. At the baker's stall, he overheard a farmer grumbling about his new purchase. "Wakes me up fine, aye? Then the cows hear it and start bellowing an hour early. Milk production's gone to hell." The baker nodded sympathetically, then added, with a pointed glare in Emeric's direction, "At least you're not married to the damn thing. My wife bought one that sings. King Zing's brother," in Latin. The walk back to the monastery felt longer than usual. Everywhere, the signs of his unintended revolution mocked him. Harried mothers herding clock-startled children, bleary-eyed merchants muttering over their ledgers, even a stray dog that flinched at the hourly chimes from the town square. Brother Hengist found him slumped on the cloister steps, listlessly poking at a snail with a stick. "Ah," he said, sitting beside him with the air of a man about to deliver terrible news. "You've seen what they've done to your invention." "It's a plague," Emmerich muttered. "A loud, punctual plague." Hengist shrugged. "Could be worse. Heard they're working on a version that sprays water in your face. Those extra stubborn sleepers." Emmerich dropped his head into his hands. Somewhere in the distance a new batch of clocks rang out, slightly out of sync, creating a discordant symphony of human misery. And then, as if to twist the knife, Lucifer strutted into view, pausing to deliver a single perfectly timed crow directly into Emmerich's ear. The rooster's expression, as much as a bird could muster one, seemed to say, "Look what you've done to our profession." Chapter 12. The Monk's Escape Attempt. Brother Emmerich slipped out of the monastery before dawn, his few belongings bundled in a sack that smelled faintly of cheese and regret. He left no note, though he did pause to scratch a brief apology into the dust of the workshop floor with a bent nail, an apology that Brother Hengist would later find and misinterpret as evidence of demonic possession. The road east led to the mountains, where travelers spoke of a hermitage so remote even the birds forgot to sing there. A place of perfect silence. A place untouched by the ceaseless ticking of his cursed invention. For 3 days he walked, his sandals collecting mud and his soul collecting hope. The villages grew smaller, the forests thicker, until at last he stood before a crooked wooden gate, bearing a sign that read, in letters carved by someone with either terrible handwriting or a shaky grasp of Latin, "Here dwells Brother Quietus, who speaks to no one and especially not you." Emmerich pushed the gate open with the reverence of a man entering a cathedral. Before him stood a hut, a garden, a traveling merchant. The man was perched on a tree stump, polishing a gleaming brass alarm clock with the sleeve of his brightly colored doublet. Brother Quietus sat opposite him, clutching a newly purchased device with the dismay of a man who had just realized he traded his last turnip for a small, noisy prism. The merchant looked up as Emmerich approached. "Ah, another holy man in need of temporal discipline. I've just sold Brother Quietus here my finest model. The Rooster's Revenge, we call it. Guaranteed to—" Emmerich turned and walked away. Behind him the merchant called out, "Wait, I've got a discount if you buy 2. The mountains were less welcoming after that. Emmerich trudged higher, past trees that grew stunted and grim, until he found a cave that smelled of damp stone and forgotten dreams. He dropped his sack, sat on a rock, and stared at the valley below. A valley now dotted with workshops producing his folly, with roads carrying merchants hawking his nightmare, with homes where angry fathers cursed his name every dawn. From his sack, he pulled the one thing he'd brought from the monastery workshop, his very first prototype, the crude little box that had started it all. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the weight of what he'd done. Then, with the solemnity of a burial, he hurled it into the chasm below. The silence that followed was beautiful. Until somewhere far below, the damn thing had landed on its one remaining gear. Emmerich lay back in the dirt and closed his eyes. Above him, a lone bird circled. Perhaps a hawk. Perhaps a vulture. It hardly mattered. He imagined it was judging him, and he couldn't disagree. Tomorrow, he would return to the monastery. Tonight, he would sleep. And if he happened to oversleep, well, the world could wait. Chapter 13. A Legacy of Sleeplessness. The lecture hall at the University of Oxford smelled of old books and older arguments. Professor Thistlethwaite adjusted his spectacles and tapped the faded woodcut projected behind him. A medieval monk scowling at a peculiar box, his expression caught somewhere between pride and profound regret. "The question remains," he intoned, was Brother Emmerich of St. Drogo's a visionary or history's greatest villain? A man who gifted humanity with punctuality, or cursed us with the tyranny of the alarm clock? A graduate student in the front row raised a hand. But didn't his own writing show he hated what he'd created? That journal entry about throwing the prototype off a cliff? Ah, Thistlethwaite interrupted. But consider the economic impact, the Industrial Revolution alone. 300 miles away, in a quiet suburban bedroom, an alarm clock buzzed angrily on a nightstand. A hand slapped it into silence. The room's occupant groaned, rolled over, and muttered into his pillow, "Damn that monk." In Tokyo, a sleek digital display flashed 6:00 a.m. A melodic chime played, followed by gentle birdsong, then increasingly aggressive beeping. Across 14 time zones, in an apartment in Chicago, a woman cursed as her phone erupted with the sound of a brass band. The world had refined Brother Emmerich's invention, but never escaped it. There were alarms that shook beds, alarms that required solving math problems, alarms that donated money to hated political causes if you didn't rise fast enough. And yet, every morning, humanity rose, grudgingly, blearily, to face the day his contraption had forced upon them. Back in the Monastery of St. Drogo's, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site and gift shop, tourists snapped photos of the original alarm clock, displayed in a bulletproof case. The placard beneath it was diplomatic, a medieval solution to the timeless problem of waking up. No mention of the angry graffiti still visible on one side, where some long-dead monk had scratched Emmerich's folly into the wood. At dusk, the caretaker flipped the sign to closed, locked the doors, and walked home past the churchyard where Brother Emmerich's grave stood, its marker worn smooth by centuries of weather and fingers. Visitors liked to rub the stone, some for luck, others as petty revenge. The caretaker paused, as he always did, to read the epitaph one more time. "Here release Brother Emmerich, who measured time too well, may finally rest in peace, and let the rest of us sleep too." Somewhere in the distance, a digital alarm clock kicked over to midnight in another time zone. A new day began, whether anyone was ready for it or not. And in the ancient rafters of the monastery, a descendant of Lucifer the rooster ruffled his feathers but did not crow. Even he, it seemed, had learned the value of sleeping in.